A very good afternoon to everyone. I am Pooja Verma from Singapore Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. It's my utmost pleasure to be here with all of you today, and I'm glad to introduce today's session. I would like to introduce the moderator of the session, Mr. Christopher Anand Daniel, the managing partner from Advocatus Law LLP Singapore. Mr. Christopher has been in practice since 1995. Prior to establishing Advocatus, he was a partner and director in Allen and Gledhill LLP and Drew and Napier LLC, respectively. Christopher has an active court and arbitration practice. He has conducted litigation and arbitration matters at all levels of courts in Singapore and before other tribunals as lead counsel, including the Court of Appeal, Singapore's highest court. His areas of practice include banking, professional negligence, contract, tort, construction, arbitration, competition, shareholder disputes, and white-collar crime. Mr. Christopher has successfully acted for Singapore statutory authorities, the Singapore government-linked companies, financial institutions, and multinational companies. Mr. Christopher, all yours, please.
Thank you, Pooja. Good afternoon to everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join us for this webinar today. Let me just start by making some brief comments about what we're going to do today. Those of you who have joined the first series will know that what was discussed then was understanding commercial contracts and dispute management. Now this is the second part of that. In series 2, we will try to discuss what the sort of real issues on the ground might arise for companies and businesses who are involved in contract negotiation, with a particular emphasis on what steps need to be taken at that stage, early stage, to try to foresee the approach towards resolution of any disputes that might arise down the line. Because it's always better to plan ahead instead of dealing with the issue if and when it arises, at which point your counterparty may have a very different approach towards the dispute than you, right? And it's easier to discuss these things, I suppose, when things are friendly and you are negotiating the initial contract, rather than starting to negotiate how to resolve a dispute after the dispute has arisen and therefore distrust has arisen. With that, let me start by introducing the chairman of the session, Mr. Khorshid Alam, who's a board member of the Singapore Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry and the managing director of Panmark Impex Private Limited. Mr. Chowdhury is a visionary with experience and expertise in trading. He is keen on furthering his outreach by engaging in manufacturing of locally made products in Bangladesh. His background with Panmark Impex, a general trader for various world-renowned brands, allowed him to embark on successful projects to set up marketing and manufacturing entities in Bangladesh. He maintains strong partnerships and is resilient to the ever-changing market, which is especially true today, right, with this pandemic, which is afflicting all of us. Mr. Chowdhury, together with his team, aspires to diversify his global footprint by furthering business relations through business activities in Bangladesh. With that, if I can ask Mr. Chowdhury to give us some remarks about today's session.
Thank you, Mr. Christopher. Dear members, guests, and panelists, very good afternoon to everyone present. On behalf of Singapore Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, I welcome you to the second series of our Trade Dispute Management and International Commercial Contracting session. In the first series, we have covered and explained the understanding commercial contracts and dispute management. The session received a very positive feedback. So now we have session 2, and for title and our title for this discussion is Mindfulness in International Commercial Contracting. With speed, automation, and digitalization taking over much of business life and dealings, quite often contracts and agreements are entered without being conscious of full implication and potential risk and responsibilities. Hence, it is important to business owners to be well acquainted with the approaches that can be built into their contracting practices. This can help them achieve more mindful approach to entering transactions and business without compromising on the speed of decision making. Hence, we are having this webinar today. During the session, we will discuss the various common issues that should be considered both at the stage of negotiating contract terms and at the same time at the stage of managing any disputes. So we will also deal with specific areas of transaction or business specific risk. Looking forward to a fruitful session. Thank you very much. Thanks again.
Thank you, Mr. Chaudhary.
Christopher, please.
Thank you. Our first speaker for this afternoon's webinar is Ms. Archana Balasubramaniam. She's the founding partner of Agama Law. Ms. Archana is a versatile lawyer with experience of over 35 years. She has gained immense technical transactional understanding, as well as significant industry expertise across diverse sectors such as manufacturing, logistics, media, pharmaceuticals, financial services, shipping, real estate, technology, engineering, infrastructure, and health. Archana is driven by the philosophy that growth of her clients is fundamental for her firm's growth. Clients regularly commend her for her result-oriented approach and ability to grasp the commercial impact of legal concerns to advise in the most pragmatic manner as a business partner. She wears the hat of a generalist and approaches agreements with a dispute experience gained over the years. Archana will speak on the risk anticipation and provisioning of initiation of contract. And if I can invite Archana to start.
Sure. Thanks so much, Christopher, for that. Let me start by wishing everyone a very good afternoon in Singapore. I hope everyone's had their lunches, and we are here today to talk about something very practical. It is not so much legal as it is practical for the purpose of how your contract is going to develop. So I will first share my screen and then maybe just start. Okay, is my screen visible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So we have chosen this topic specifically on mindfulness in contracting. Let us spend 5 minutes on mindfulness. There's a lot of literature around mindfulness. People are taking up meditation, etc. But we have sort of imbibed that philosophy into contract drafting and contract negotiation and closures. So what does mindfulness really mean? Mindfulness means being fully present and aware and taking actions, understanding and knowing what the consequences will be. Mindfulness from the perspective of businesses largely sort of deals with two aspects. One is, when it comes to a contract, is the contract aligned with your larger business objective? And have you achieved a certain level of comfort where you know that you are going to avoid future disputes? As far as the larger business objectives are concerned, very often what we see is that when there are, especially for large companies, where there is a board, where there is a set of management and the contracts are being negotiated by maybe someone at a lower level, the information that comes across to the legal team, the sort of background that is being given to the legal team is all sort of around the mechanics of the contract. But we need to speak to our legal team. We need to ascertain within ourselves whether we are able to align this contract with the larger business objective. Like, for instance, when you are as a distributor or as a person who is a supplier of a commodity, what is that contract going to achieve for you? Are you going to acquire a new geography? Are you going to is it going to improve your revenues? Is it going to give you better margins? What is that objective? Is this going to help you in your objective of being a global company? What is that objective that that contract is going to achieve? So that's something that needs to be seen. We are going to dwell a little more on it in in the later slides. The second aspect of mindfulness is today being aware of potential disputes and trying to avoid it. There are two aspects to disputes. One is a dispute that arises from the non-performance of a contract, and other is a dispute that arises on account of change in circumstances that affect the party. So in this presentation, we are going to see how we are going to be mindful of these situations and how the negotiations are to be carried out to avoid such issues. At the center of mindfulness is being fully present. So how does one ensure that they are fully present while negotiating the contract or while drafting it? Okay, so first, there are three aspects to it, three pillars of it. What is it that you want to achieve? We just spoke about it, whether it's a larger business objective, whether it is more revenue. What is it that we want to achieve? And therefore, is the risk that we are proposing to take with this contract commensurate with what we want to achieve? So that analysis needs to be done by the organization so that the lawyers can accordingly allocate the risks and capture it in the document. Where are we in the process cycle of performance? So where are we can be answered in several ways. So what is it that the company is currently doing with the counterpart? Are there already transactions underway? Very often what happens is most people are negotiating the finer parts of the contract when certain transactions have already occurred. So understanding where you are is very important. It is possible that if you have already in the transaction, if you're already aware of what's going on, then it will be difficult for you to negotiate certain clauses, like negotiate an exclusivity or negotiate, a termination consequence, which you could have otherwise done if you were entering into the contract. Having already started the transactions, do you still have the leverage to do that? That is something that needs to be reviewed, something that needs to be understood by the parties. And what is being done? What is being done as in what are the processes that are involved in this transaction? So there could be a simple sale of commodities, in which case then you are looking at the licenses, etc. There could be a certain level of processing at the time of as a person who's a distributor. You may be doing some assembly, or you may be doing some kind of a packaging prior to putting it in the market. You may be responsible for the actual marketing of the product. So what is being done by the parties? A great clarity of that needs to be there. Someone needs to box it that this is an obligation of X, this is an obligation of Y, so that you understand very clearly that your agreement sort of reflects that. So what we do as a more practical tip is, when we are drafting contracts, we create a mind map. We create a mind map of what are the 6 or 7 clauses that we want to make sure. What are the 6 or 7 attributes of that contract? For example, if I'm doing a distribution agreement, for me, the 6 or 7 attributes would be what is the kind of, at what point of time will the product be picked up, who's going to be responsible for payment of the logistics, what are the obligations post picking up the product, how is the manufacturer going to be involved in the marketing. So we create a sort of mind map where we get answers to these questions, and this is sometimes done where the businesses are very organized, we get the answers very quickly, but otherwise it offers food for thought for the persons who are entering into the contract. And this mind map is going to be your base for drafting and negotiating of the contracts. So you can keep coming back to it and see whether you are deviating from it and how you are sort of, aligned to that. I'm going to, as a part of for this the webinar, I am going to dwell more on negotiations, because as a contract draftsman, a negotiation is a very critical part of the drafting exercise. While it is very easy to draft in the vacuum and, I can make a very stringent agreement for my client, at the end of the day, the contract is an evolved document where parties sort of agree to a lot of things, and they put down those concepts and sort of set a roadmap for the future. So the evolution of the contract happens through negotiations. The heart of a contract is in its commercial terms. I cannot draft a legal contract in the vacuum. It has to be a contract where we understand fully the commercial terms between parties. What is the give and take? In a simple situation like a manufacturer versus a distributor situation, or in a supplier and seller situation, I can give you an example of what has happened in one of our contracts when we were negotiating. We took almost 6 months to negotiate the contract. It was a very difficult negotiation because both parties were not in the same jurisdiction. The laws, the approach to the drafting of the contract, to the language, everything was different. So parties there was a lot of back and forth. During that negotiation, we, as the manufacturers, pushed all of the obligations on the distributor. And we said that, look, this is the kind of, you are the distributor, we are a young company, we are not in your jurisdiction, we cannot help you with after sales. So they said, all right, we will do all the after sales. Then we said, you are going to do the assembly, so we are not going to be responsible for any issues that arise from assembly. They said, all right, we will take care of these issues. So like this, we kept adding the obligations and they accepted it. After 6 months, the principal from their side came down and said, all right, we have now almost closed the contract, let's close the margins. So if we are going to do all of this, we need higher margins. Now that kind of threw the entire calculations of our clients out of whack. So while the other party agreed to very kindly to take on those obligations, it translated into a commercial outflow for the manufacturer, which was neither intended nor good for the manufacturer. So this is an example of a situation where if you don't understand the commercial aspects of the deal, if you don't understand where the other party is commercially, you will have issues in closing the negotiation successfully. The other thing we've always believed is key to the performance of a contract, how well you perform the contract, is in understanding the operations. You have to know at any given point of time, what is the obligation of X, what is X going to do, and what does X need from Y to complete that obligation. Now, if like this, we see a lot in EPC contracts, we see this a lot in sort of technology contracts, but in simple distribution contracts, we don't see this. So for example, are there any licenses that the distributor needs at his jurisdiction to even accept your shipment? Now, if that is the case, then the distributor needs to first go out and get the license. I may be sitting with ready products, but I cannot ship it out because the distributor has not procured that license in his local jurisdiction. So it's very important to understand the operations so that people can capture it upfront in the document. And negotiations is a beautiful way to do it, because very often what you get back from the lawyers will be sort of, in that sense, obscure or maybe very broad based. But when you actually, when the parties sit down to speak, there are very clear pointers that come out that, okay, we are acceptable, this is acceptable to us and this is not. So I've just put together like a few touchstones of negotiation, what we keep in mind while we are doing it. First and foremost, we never deviate from the purpose. This is what we discussed. Whatever is the purpose of the contract, we have to be able to achieve it. So if a contract is for us to enter a new market, then we need to sort of ensure that it is not, we are not diluting the contract. I can give you an example of apparels company which wanted to enter a certain market. They entered into the agreement with a distributor who said that they would be able to put up the retail stores and everything in these locations. Now, there was a particular jurisdiction that this company wanted to enter, and the distributor was from another jurisdiction in Europe. So what happened as a result is, in the contract, when we started negotiating, the distributor was very comfortable with XYZ locations, but not the A location that was required by my client. So let's say, for instance, my client wanted to enter UK. The distributor was comfortable setting up stores in every other location except UK. So this never, so the contract ideally never went through, because found this out during negotiation. So we should never deviate from the purpose. Negotiations are a great place to find out the reality of the parties. This brings us to the next point, understanding counterparts. So whether your counterpart is a big entity, is it a small entity, how is your counterpart doing financially, what are the obligations that they can take, what are the obligations that they would outsource, and things like that need to be understood while doing the negotiations. Also, a very important thing to understand is, why is your counterpart so interested in this deal? When you understand that, you will sort of get a flavor of which are the clauses that your counterpart will not budge on, and which are the clauses that they would be happy to sort of give into. So this gives you a good flavor of what in the contract is acceptable and not to the counterpart. We are very happy to sign these large contracts, which are, $10 million revenue, $20 million revenue, etc. But there are two small kinks that can throw the entire calculation off. One is any local restrictions, banking channel restrictions, very important to understand it during negotiation. We have had situations where entire deal has got called off because there is no way for directly remitting the amount without a certain form filing, or without certain undertakings being given. Similarly, what is the impact of taxation? This is very important to understand. Now, this is where we would always advise clients, because as a law firm, we don't really advise on tax, but especially when it comes to international transactions, we always advise clients, please speak to your auditors, understand what the tax impact on the transaction is. Is there a special tax? Is there a goods and service tax? Is there any income tax implication or of you, especially when you're dealing with US, etc. You need to understand what is the status of tax and how it's going to affect your consideration inflow. Expensive obligations. Now, this is something that we as lawyers always caution our clients from undertaking. I can give you an example. This client of ours is in the business of manufacturing certain very high quality explosion proof devices. They had a situation where they signed a contract where it was a big client. So they signed the contract on the dotted line, and the contract had a clause which said that you will ensure service is completed at the location of the client at no additional cost. Now, this is a seemingly simple sentence, and logically, it's my product. So if something goes wrong, I have to service it. But what happened in reality is that both the parties were in India, and the product was actually in UAE. So when the Indian party accepted this, they didn't realize that they had to go to UAE to actually complete the service, and they have agreed to do it at their own cost. So these are some of the things that we need to keep in mind. When we undertake obligations, we need to do a backward calculation on what is the cost involved, what is the impact of it on the revenues, and then decide. Now, while this is commercial for a legal person to capture it in the document, the commercial team has to inform the legal people of these issues so that they can, sort of ensure that it is taken care of. There are small things. You can add provisos, you can speak to the party and carve out exceptions. These can happen during negotiation. Impossibility of performance. Sometimes clients agree to things which become subsequently impossible because of a change of law, or are actually impossible even at the time that they were agreed. So it needs to be checked at each point, what is the ability of the parties to perform the contract. Insurance has two aspects. Who is going to insure the product that is getting supplied? Who is going to get insured for the liabilities that are going to arise? So depending on the jurisdiction, let's say that as an Indian party is dealing with a Singapore party, or with a US party, or a Singapore party is dealing with a EU party, then in these cases, it becomes very important to understand what are the insurances that can be obtained, especially if it's a mass product, if it is a product that involves some kind of is a kind of a difficult what do you call it, product which has certain impact when you use it, like an environmental impact or something like that. So these are things that people need to understand and discuss upfront and include in contracts, because after the contract has been concluded, if this issue were to come out that in order for me to commence my business in that jurisdiction, I need to take certain insurances and the cost of that insurance is prohibitive, then it may throw the entire deal out of whack. We need to also have a mechanism of monitoring performance by the counterpart. How is your counterpart going to perform the contract? How are you going to monitor it? At what point of time will you point out to the counterpart that, hey, your performance is not up to the mark and I need certain deviations? All of this needs to be discussed during negotiations and closed. And last but not the least, parties need to know what is going to happen when the contract is going to come to an end and how it's going to get closed. This is very important. This we see a lot in IT contracts, or contracts which are very IP heavy. At exit, each party thinks that they're going to take away the IP. But is it actually possible? If you have created a product, are you going to leave the product? Are you both going to have the right to use the product at the time of exit? What is it that you're going to do at the time of exit? When will you exit? Can you exit during the, what happens if you exit during the performance? What happens if you exit after you've finished the delivery? What happens if your contract automatically terminates? Now, in each of these situations, parties need to appreciate the other's position, understand what the other is expecting at the time of exit, so that other commercial terms can be agreed upfront. So in the last session, we spoke of risks and how to capture them. And in this session, we are going to sort of look at how to mitigate the risks once they are captured. And can you mitigate the risk through negotiations and through contract drafting? So before you commence, and Nitin's going to spend some time on this, on the obligations on the board itself, when dealing with risks. But before you commence from the perspective of a contract management or contract performance situation, it's important to look at the various risks associated with the contract and start backwards from there. So you look at statutory risks. Examples of the statutory risks are environmental risks or other such risks that require you to obtain some special license or some special approvals. There could also be IP related risks, where in a jurisdiction you may not get a certain protection. There could be certain labor compliances that you as a person who is operating in the foreign jurisdiction will need to sort of have. You may need to have certain certificates to even be able to receive funds from a particular company. You need to have the ability to complete the KYC. Now, while these are very seemingly simple things, we are a situation where a company in India with minor investment from a company from one of the countries in Africa was rejected the KYC status because at that time US had an issue with that particular company. There were sanctions in that particular country, there were sanctions imposed, etc. So you need to be very clear as to what are these risks and document as to what could happen if these risks were to arise. The other type of risk in the contract is the commercial risk. Commercial risk would be something like a product liability risk, or the fact that a product can become obsolete, the fact that you will be there, the product is easily replicable and can be duplicated and sold. So these are all commercial risks that you may have during the life cycle of the contract. So the first step is identifying the risk, identify the 5 or 6 key issues. And in this, a big support is from the ground team, the team that is on the ground going to execute and perform the contract. They will be able to tell you, okay, these are the problems that we have faced. And once you identify the risk, you decide which party is going to bear the consequence of that risk or bear the burden of that risk. So I'll give you an example of a deal we did. It was a IP heavy deal. It was a very unique product which was being shipped out to US, and we understood that it is possible that the IP, there could be IP infringement claims in the US. So the distributor said, look, it's not my lookout. It's not my product. The product is yours. So the IP is yours. I said, hey, I'm not going to be there. I don't know what representations you're going to make when you talk to your dealers. And I don't know how you're going to do that. So I'm not going to be involved in the process of distribution. So after a lot of discussion and debate, they came up with the concept of a recall of the products. Then we came up with the concept of a distributor initiated recall versus a manufacturer initiated recall, and these would be 2 different things. Now this has come out only during the negotiations, because otherwise it's very easy to say, oh, all IP infringement claims belong to a X party. So therefore important to understand how you're allocating the risk. And negotiations, it is very important during negotiations to close it in principle and not leave it for later. Once having allocated it, it has to be explicitly captured in the agreement. It is not good enough for parties to understand that this is how they're going to do it, because very often what happens is once an agreement is signed, people are not going to look beyond the agreement to understand it. So a court of law will look only at the words of the agreement, and not any email exchange or any sort of negotiation notes, etc. So therefore, it's very important to ensure that this is captured. We also have suggested to clients in certain cases where we are not sure whether the counterpart has the ability to run with the risk. We've also suggested certain liquidated damages provisions or certain indemnification provisions, which today will give you the right to step into their shoes and claim that back from the other party. So to sum up, at the time of negotiation, the key clauses that are being negotiated have to come from the top management. The top management has to tell you that, look, this is key for us, and these are the clauses from which you cannot deviate. This will change from deal to deal. It would change from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So it's very important for the key management to at least set the tone of the negotiation. The risk at the time of performance could be threefold. There could be local issues, what we discussed, whether it is related to the law, whether it's related to the customs in that area, or whether it's related to a higher expectation of margins. Those are all local issues in relation to performance. Operational hurdles, given the different jurisdictions, and deviations on the ground. So while performing the contract, there are very often deviations, and how you're going to deal with that. That is something that during negotiations you can discuss and arrive at a process. We always advise clients that you arrive at a process. I can give you an example of a force majeure clause that was being negotiated during the pandemic, where we said that where we wanted the word epidemic to become a force majeure event. The way the force majeure operated, the client, which was a very large Singapore entity, refused to accept pandemic as a force majeure event simply because they said, hey, you're going to perform services from your country, you're going to perform remote services. And, I don't think pandemic can be an exception to it. So then after negotiations, we agreed that what would be an exception is a government imposed lockdown, which prohibits us from performing services. So this is the kind of thing that sort of comes up during negotiations. Now, what happens after the contract has been executed? Very often the parties' position changes, their financial position or their interest in the deal may change. Like when cryptocurrencies were hot, we were doing a lot of deals for companies that were accepting payment in crypto. But as time went forward and some of these currencies failed, the technology companies lost interest. But can you just leave the contract there? So you need to negotiate or renegotiate changes to the contract, enter into addendum to sort of understand the changed position between the parties, and to ensure that your original contract reads as amended with this. Of course, we've also seen changes in law that have necessitated changes to contract. So the parties have to meet and negotiate the issues that arise from a change in law. I'm not going to dwell on this in too much detail because Nitin is going to take it up in his session. So this is from me. Long and short of it is negotiation, whether during the contract, during a dispute, or after the performance, after the contract has been signed and the contract is being performed, needs to be guided by the top management. Your legal team has to be advised of all of these factors that we just discussed so that they can take care of it in the documentation. That's it from me.
Thank you, Archana. Our next speaker is Mr. Nitin Jain. He's the managing partner of Agama Law Associates. Nitin comes with a rich experience of over a decade as an in-house lawyer, as well as a practicing professional. Because of his extensive experience in handling transactional advisory, governance, and compliance matters, Nitin has an exceptional understanding of the nuances faced by clients and their expectations from legal service professionals. Nitin will speak to us about importing boardroom wisdom into terms of agreements. Nitin, do you want to take it from there?
Sure. Thank you, Christopher. Thank you, Archana. Good afternoon, all the esteemed members who are attendees to this session. Objective is definitely to tell you that whether you engage lawyer or not, these are the key things which are very relevant for your businesses. And today's recent times, the dynamics have changed. As the owners, the responsibility, the fiduciary duty of each of you as a promoter, partner, or director of the company has become multifold. Why I am saying this is because now the times have gone when the boardroom, the meeting for the promoters, partners were a tea or a snack room meeting and nothing beyond tea or snacks. Now there is a large responsibilities and owners which has been provided on the companies to maintain a very fundamental concept that company is a legal entity, and so the directors and promoters are independent from the company, and they need to play a vital role for their business growth at every point in time. I completely understand that each promoter's businesses running their businesses and most of the time goes in the business development. Unless there is a business, these things all becomes subsequent in nature and are directly connected to the business growth. So majority times is in the business development, majority times goes in the team stability, in production, in manufacturing, in trading, overseeing, running the operations day in and day out. So what is that the few things which the objective of the tips to give it to you is, whenever you are doing any of these things, you don't need to independently do these legal aspects, but keep it in your mind so that you run a very sustainable risk mitigated business in the long run, and avoid any risk which becomes a surprise and takes away your hard earned business which is created by you. So directors, while I'm using this word directors, I'm sure most of the companies who are LLPs, who are partners, promoters, or directors of a private companies, public companies, listed companies who are part of this session, is objective is to tell them that they have a fiduciary duty, qua the company, qua the management and the other board members, and what they really need to do. Any business decision, any material key business decision taken for the company should be in the interest of the company, should not be in conflict with the interest of the company, should be done with the proper protocols, adequate measures put it in the company. Because if you think that you will tell tomorrow for any non-compliances which attacks or triggers on the company, saying that, hey, we were not aware, ignorance of law is not an excuse, and this was never an excuse. So this fiduciary duty puts a lot of ownership and a gross negligence on the board of directors. So if you become a director or a partner or a promoter, you need to play a very significant role to be aware of what you are signing, to be aware of what you are getting into. Because if you say it's my family run business and I only know how to run business and nothing else is important for me, I'm sorry, the times have gone where in cross-border deals, the foreign authorities can attach and assets, attach your properties. The foreign authorities can summon you to their jurisdiction. Lot of things have been changed over past few decades. So one needs to be very cautious while dealing with the business for certain sustainable growth. Moves on the fines and penalties. Objective is not to scare you in your running day-to-day business and the growth, but I've seen in the very recent times, very often I'm seeing that a lot of directors approaching us saying that we have done it in good faith. Please, I'm sorry, the code does not recognize the good faith. If you have been given certain responsibility under the law to run the businesses successfully, mentioned and ensuring that the statutory compliance are being managed, then one needs to take care of that. One of the director who was approached was a director to a listed company, and he had played a good role, but some of the meetings he has not attended, due to which the related party transactions which were taken care in the company, and in case of a breach, the registrar, the authorities, the competent authorities has given him a claim and breach of siphoning of funds. They have gone and beyond, said attach his assets and properties, and he is currently facing a multi-jurisdiction litigation for few mistakes of not properly adequately ensuring that whether he has said yes or no and proper documents have been maintained, being a part of those committees. So it's extremely complex in every jurisdiction nowadays to just not become a simply board member, but to play your role very carefully. One needs to be very careful when creating these entities. It should not be just with the mind of saying that we are having a tax advantage from one to the other country. So, hey, we can create a company. Now, maintaining the company, compliance of the companies, regular upkeep of the company is equally important, and those costs need to be factored from the long-term vision when you are creating and incorporating these companies in Singapore, Dubai, or any other foreign jurisdictions, or in India, so to say. What is a board's key obligations when you are doing these business transactions and discussions in regular? You may not get time to have a meeting. Some may become a very closed room meetings because they are family driven businesses. They are very settled and set businesses over the period of time. Extremely important is one of the key factor is regulatory approvals and licenses for the business, because the licenses which were taken earlier, whether they have been renewed or time, any new licenses under the change in law and regime have been obtained, have been identified to be obtained. The new law which has come in India, the GST law, the various new laws which have come. For example, you are a owner of a logistics industry, whether you have proper FIATA, IATA, MTO registrations, and so on and so forth, the business connected registrations. Because if these registrations are not in place, the risk is that your business can be shut down at any point in time by the regulatory authorities, and can impose a very heavy fine. If you are in the trading businesses, manufacturing businesses, which are directly related to the products and not services, then whether these products are manufactured by you or you are only a mere marketer of the product, the risk is associated with the both. So one needs to really know that it is not only a profit driven margin. This product, I can take 10 products and sell it to the foreign jurisdiction because they have a very good margin. Are they legally compliant? Are there any legal risks associated with those products? And if so, what are the adequate measures board has thought through to ensure the proper compliances and de-risk the company as well as the promoters? So one needs to check it because it's a heart of your business. The taxation laws, which Archana has already dwelt upon it, for certain business risk. Business risk is a very wide term, and one shoe may not fit to the other one. I want to touch upon a few aspects of the business risk. A geopolitical risk, risk of a competitor, currency risk, which is extremely important. I've seen and met many owners of the business who have, when done the business initially, have not hedged their risk. So when there is a volatile price in the currency and they have not done the hedging, they really beaten away by the currency fluctuation. And some people have to really change the way they were doing and operating the businesses. So each business has to, in a timely manner, whether it is quarterly, 6 monthly, annually, you are the owner, you will know how much frequency you need to allocate to your business risk, so that you're, with the times changes, you are able to continuously upgrade and make it align with the business risk and mitigate those risks with growth of your businesses in a timely manner. What is next is basically a key business contractual terms. You would be wondering why I have said the contract terms versus the boardroom. Boardroom is not concerned with the contract terms, but yes, they are concerned when there are very material contracts. When you say a top 5 vendor contract or a top 5 customer contracts, you are a business owner. You must need to know. You cannot leave it to the down operating level that these contracts can be executed by the executive operation team or a marketing head or a sales head, because they are directly linked and affected in case of any complication arises. So you need to be involved. The board needs to oversee those contracts very carefully. This contract may not be a 20-pager contract. This may be a 2-pager purchase order or a work order, but have you seen those contracts? Have you apportion and risk mitigation, what you have meant, are covered under those 2-page contract? If you have the answer, whenever even the risk arises, you will be able to deal with it. If you have not seen it, it may create a exposure financially or non-financially to the company and to you individually as well. So review the existing contracts with change in law having a material impact. Very recently, one of our clients example where we have seen a GST is a new norm where you are taking the advantage of the GST, while the person with whom you are dealing also need to be a properly compliant. What happen if he does not do a proper compliance of GST? You are not able to take the benefit of it, or you may have a direct cash leakage because of his non-compliances. And these leakages are not at 2 layers, they are at multi-layer contracts and multi-layer parties. And if you would like to know the exposure, it can go into few millions of dollars because of every vendor with whom you are dealing, every customer supplier whom you are dealing or customer, these are directly impacted. So is your contract covering those consequences? If answer is no, then you cannot go behind them and ask them to make it more compulsory or withhold their payment, adjust their payments, create a lien on the goods. You can't do any of these things if your contract does not speak about it. Careful identification and allocation of the risk exposure. You may have to have a 2 or 3 parameters under which you run these businesses. So when I said these 2, 3 parameters, because each business, when you are in a very service oriented business, who are your key customers? What are the imposing SLAs, service levels, which are very have a high financial exposure on you? What are the products, delivery of those products, if not done in the timely manner, what could be the impact? How are you going to mitigate the risk? Needs to be really thought through. What one needs to do is always consider and remember that no matter how big or small you are, limitation of liability plays a very significant role, because one can only take the risk and exposure to the extent you are a business owner risk with your knowledge. Because if you don't cap your liability and any unforeseen unlimited liability enters your door, the businesses can be wiped out which have created over generations. So one needs to be very careful in contracting these days, because the exposure can be as high as closure of the entire business due to the one wrong decision or one wrong business being taken. International jurisdiction governing law. Sumit would definitely take most of the suggestion, the advice in the next session. Will not touch upon it, but please, limited advice is do not enter into a contract with the country where you are not conversant with it, because countries like, for example, OFAC is one compliance, is you are doing a trade with US and you are doing a trade with some other country which are restricted trade by US, you will have a substantial exposure which you cannot even imagine. So please be mindful. I would say the word mindful again, because just do not jump in the opportunity business, but be mindful in taking entry in those jurisdictions and get familiar by using those experts. So next is the what are the boards which they can really dwell into. Ensure that the contracts are not having a conflict in interest. Wherever the related party transactions, most of you have created an entity or may have a dealing where you are a common person in those entities in different jurisdictions. Are your transactions qualifying as a related party transaction? Because you may think very optimistically that this is my own company, I can deal the way I want. But law does not look at it that way. Law look at it that you are making an unlawful gain. What are the checks and balances if you are having from exchange of one hand to another hand, trade, services, benefits, rental, exchange of money, transfer of goods? You need to ensure that if it is a related party transaction, are you properly compliant? As a business owners, your legal business templates should be always standardized in nature, which gives you a good sleep that your SOP checklist is in place. Any change in law which you discuss at the board level need to have a cascading effect, and on the ground operation team should be aware, and changes should be made in those templates to ensure that your business is legally compliant and sustainably growing with the risk mitigation plan in place. So last is a bit on the corporate governance. Each company need to really look into their businesses, have a proper code of conduct in place, health safety norms in place. In current days, due to the data privacy laws being different in different jurisdiction, proper data protection policies in place, have a proper mechanism if required to have an independent director who can view from the third eyes perspective on your business. Must have that independent director to ensure that you run a long sustainable professional institution. as far as the risks are concerned, it should be also not only qua the customer supplier, but also qua the shareholders, because in active shareholder regime, shareholders may look at it that the value has not been created the way it should have been created by having few friends and family round investments in your company. Then you need to create a proper safeguards against those shareholders' interest also. So with this note, my suggestion to the business owners is, with your business development time, with your operational time, allocate certain times in your day-to-day running business. Be mindful of these decisions, what you are taking, in the keeping in current and the future risk exposure in mind. Thank you, all the members.
Thank you, Nitin. Our next speaker is Mr. Sumit Rai. He is counsel and international arbitration expert. Sumit has been a disputes lawyer with 14 years experience in handling commercial disputes. He's appeared as counsel in various forums, including international arbitration, domestic arbitration, Supreme Court, high courts, security appellate tribunals, and national company law tribunals. Sumit has a wealth of experience in a wide range of arbitration and commercial disputes. He has represented clients in arbitrations held under all major institutional rules, including the ICC, LCIA, SIAC, etc., and governed by various substantive laws. He has dealt with complex cross-border disputes involving multiple jurisdictions and practice areas and claims spanning from a few $1 million to up to $6 billion. He has special expertise in providing strategic advice to clients in managing disputes of all levels of complexity and spanning various jurisdictions, forums, and subject areas. He has also assisted clients with impact of bilateral investment treaties on their transactions. Sumit will speak to us about what he calls the prenup approach to commercial disputes. Sumit, if you can take it from there.
Thanks, Christopher. Good afternoon, everyone. I will take you through some of the points that I want to highlight, which I believe can help you structure your transaction in such a way that even though you don't want to think about it at the time of entering a deal, in case something goes wrong or you reach a place where there is a huge disagreement with the other party, at that point, you are not running helter-skelter. You have thought of it and you have a roadmap ready to deal with it. That's why I start with a cliche, in that sense, comparison with prenup, because of course, often the example is given when we talk of dispute resolution clauses, that it's like, who wants to talk about divorce when you're getting married? But all the high net worth individuals around the world will tell you that they do want to talk about it and protect themselves. And probably no matter what your turnover is for you, your business is as high net worth as it can get. And therefore, you would like your transaction to go through smoothly. But if it does not, you would like a proper roadmap to resolve the disputes. And therefore, I always say that you should look at drafting a dispute resolution clause, or as I will suggest in this presentation, crafting a roadmap to resolving various problems that can arise during execution of contract as a part of the transaction, rather than something that may come up post transaction. It's a if, and we will see when it arrives. Just put in a arbitration clause from somewhere, or just put in a jurisdictional clause of a court from somewhere, and that will take care of it. That's an approach I will suggest you not take. And my suggestion would be that you should look at your negotiation of clauses which will resolve potential disputes as a part of the transaction that you're entering. One thing that I want to start with is the fact that as a businessman, you need not think in terms of the definitions that we lawyers have created for our understanding. You need not think of a clause as a dispute resolution clause, and therefore when you are thinking of a dispute resolution clause, you should only think of arbitration or mediation or court, or just choosing a court, a place where the court will have jurisdiction, etc. When you are thinking dispute resolution, you need to think like a businessman. You are entering a transaction. In that transaction, what do you see as potential issues arising tomorrow, which probably today when you are entering the transaction, neither party is anticipating, but may very likely arise. And ask yourself that the contract you are going to sign, how does that contract provide for it? Sometimes the resolution of most likely issues in a particular transaction, in a particular business, will be in probably a commercial agreement in advance on what happens if. And sometimes it will be relegated to something that will be resolved through a arbitration or court or any other means that you decide. But the idea is that when you are entering into the contract, you must think about it, that if the problem arises, what is the option in my contract for its resolution? And when you start thinking of disputes in that sense, you will usually come out with contracts that take care of most problems that you can think. Therefore, I say that when you are now, I'll give some ideas about how to craft your dispute clauses. And I will suggest that let's destroy the concepts we have of dispute resolution clauses just about being governing law, just about being court, etc., and create something new. What I suggest we should do is, when you are looking at your contract and deciding whether it adequately provides for potential disputes and whether it provides a robust roadmap in case you eventually enter into a disputed area, what you should look at is not just that whether I have a good arbitration clause or a court jurisdiction clause. What you should also look at is, do you have a pathway for a problem that mostly arises in your kind of transaction? You have had the experience of those type of problems arising in the past, and you know that no one can with guarantee say that the problem will not arise tomorrow. What is the resolution that you have provided to that problem in your contract? Therefore, in disputes, look at it in two parts. The first part being, what are the clauses you have in the contract which takes care of an immediate concern that you may have, and which, if relegated to a final resolution by arbitration or court alone, may not solve anybody's problem. Because if you have to wait for 16 months or 18 months to get a result to that issue that you're facing, that is not going to be good enough for you, given the nature of the issue that you're contemplating. And therefore, always think of disputes in two forms. How are you going to take care of the problem when there is a disagreement in the immediate, and how will any dispute get finally resolved through a binding order? Both of them are important and both should be thought through independently. So I'll talk a little about what I mean when I talk interim resolutions, because I feel they sometimes are of more importance and least thought about, because what we think is, in every case, an interim resolution will be whatever the dispute resolution mechanism itself provides. For instance, if you choose arbitration, you will have an option to seek interim reliefs. You may have option to seek to go to a court and seek an interim relief in support of the arbitration. If you have a court proceeding, there too you will have an option to seek through a notice of motion or a interim application some relief from the court. But what I feel is, if you have thought through in your particular type of business, what are the most important, most likely issues that can arise, and provided some indication of how it will be resolved, may be very unique to your case. It can really go very far. I'll give you a few examples. Now, for instance, indemnity, particularly in acquisition, etc., very a large part of your negotiation time is spent on indemnities. And sometimes, depending on how much negotiating power you have, the indemnity clauses will be very wide. And it is important because imagine you are acquiring a business, you have done all your due diligence, but there can never be an assurance that something unknown or unknowable will not in the future come up, which relates to a liability that has arisen before you acquired the business, and will not be such a large liability that it might in fact threaten your entire acquisition itself. And yes, arbitration will take care of it. You'll go to arbitration, you'll fight it out. And let's say the losses are in billions of dollars or millions of dollars. You might even win at the end. But the 2 years or 2.5 or 3 years that it takes to get there, will it be sufficient for you? Will you have enough liquidity to carry on that business as a going concern after having spent a large upfront money in acquiring that business and then being thrown with this huge liability that has come? So have you thought of a way to make sure that there is some kind of a structure on if a liability of this kind arises, then they need to proactively protect you, if required, put up a bank guarantee? Nobody wants to talk about it because that may derail the deal, but probably you should bring it up in your negotiations, probably if not very categorically about providing a bank guarantee. Something else may be provided somewhere in the contract, which will then help you in the arbitration to get a quicker interim relief without too much argument on whether you are entitled to it or not. If you have thought about it, probably you will be able to provide for it. But if you are just satisfied with the indemnity clause and the arbitration clause, you might be taken by surprise how difficult it is then to protect yourself in the interim. Similar example you will face on a daily basis when you are doing trading, international trade contracts, supplying goods, etc., where despite very good negotiations, everything hunky-dory, when you actually, the time comes for the buyer to pick the goods, he's not picking the goods, he's not opening the LC, and the prices have gone up or down, and therefore the approach has changed. So what happens then? Can you go ahead and sell that good to somebody else, or will you have to wait up? Will you have to go get permission of some court to sell that good? These are things that you should think of. And probably, I think, let's say you are a coal trader, and there is a very specific way in which things happen in your trade. And it should be possible for you to provide for a few ifs and buts of what happens if, etc. And not just rely on an interim relief to be claimed from an arbitrator if a dispute arises, or go to court and claim an interim relief, because sometimes that takes long. And in balancing interest of parties, the specific requirements of the trade may be lost. Similarly, I don't know how much of relevance it may be to people attending this seminar, but if you do infrastructure projects or construction projects, which sometimes the construction itself takes 3 to 5 years, or BOT projects where you're going to operate a thing that you built for say 20, 30 years. In those cases, everything cannot always be taken to arbitration or court, because practically that just cannot work. Every time there is a disagreement, you can't say, okay, let's go to arbitration, because arbitration is a very, very specific legal process which takes time. And in that meantime, it can't be that your port or your, say, thermal power plant or something just stops functioning because there is a disagreement. In those cases, of course, there are various means by which those are managed, sometimes by an employer's appointed expert, etc. But one very good innovation of the last couple of decades, maybe, but becoming popular recently in the last decade, I would say, is disputes review board. In those large contracts, at the time of entering into the contract itself, for these day-to-day issues where any special disagreements arise, people provide for a prefixed dispute review board to which you submit. They just on a not very formal hearing basis, look at your argument, look at the other side's argument, and decide this is the right way to go. And you are bound to do that at that time. And you may very well challenge it eventually in arbitration and claim a reversal of benefits. But at that time, you will have to act depending on what the dispute review board decides. So that's an option you should look at if you're looking at larger contracts. Also, what you should look at is today you live in a global world where anything with an international element can be taken anywhere in the world. I'm sure you've been told that if you select a seat of arbitration, that country's courts will have exclusive jurisdiction over that arbitration. So you won't be surprised if somebody taking you somewhere else. But that's not true when it comes to interim reliefs, because the exception to that exclusive jurisdiction aspect of seat of arbitration is that interim reliefs can yet be sought anywhere in the world where it may be effective to seek interim relief, because and this is done to support international arbitration, because there may be situations where one of the parties lives somewhere else and the seat of arbitration is, say, Singapore, and an order from a Singapore court or an arbitrator giving you a relief against that person will not be very effective. So you need to approach that court. So in those situations, is it the case that what I'm suggesting is that when you are entering into the contract, you must think, let's say you are entering into a SIAC arbitration and there is a very, very effective emergency arbitration provision. You did not want to enter into a court jurisdiction because you don't want to go to local courts. So probably you can exclude that. Even for interim reliefs, you can have a clause which says that only emergency arbitrators will grant interim reliefs and parties will not move the courts. And at least to some extent that will prevent you taken by surprise by somebody moving a local court somewhere. Once you've dealt with interim disputes, of course, nothing can substitute the final resolution of a dispute through a binding adjudicatory option. And that must be a part of your contract. It should not be left to imagination or to law taking its own course, because then in an international situation, the amount of complications that can arise in those situations is just unbelievable. And you will be caught up in so many gateway issues that before your dispute actually takes off, you will be spending years in where that dispute will go, what will be the law that applies to it, who will appoint the arbitrator. And that's not something that any business ever wants. And in this, you must remember that all innovations aside, there remains only two options that can give you a final binding, legally binding order, and that is court or arbitration. All other options can be used in combination with either of these two options, but a final adjudicatory order, which is binding on you whether you want it or not to be binding, is either court or arbitration. So don't get caught up with providing for a mediation and expert determination or something of that kind and thinking that this will take care of all my disputes. No, it will not, because if mediation fails, then you are back to the place you started, because then after the mediation fails, you don't have an adjudicatory option in your contract. So no matter what else you provide for, you must consciously choose which court or which arbitration. Then really the question is, because we always now talk about arbitration, are courts really an option in an international situation? That's a question that really troubles businesses sometimes. Sometimes you may have had a bad experience in an arbitration and you think, I don't want to go back to arbitration. I want to go to court. Why don't people go to court in international situations? There are some very good reasons for that. First of them being that there are jurisdictional issues with that. Let's say you are a Singapore party and an Indian party doing business with each other, and the Indian party doesn't want to go to the Singapore court for whatever psychological reasons. The Singapore party doesn't want to come to the Indian courts. And it is not like arbitration, if like two people from India and Singapore can easily choose any other place as their seat of arbitration. It's not like that when it comes to choosing a court. You can't just go and choose, say, the courts of Paris as your courts of jurisdiction, unless the rules of procedure of Paris courts allow jurisdiction in cases where Paris may have nothing to do with the transaction and there may be none of the parties living there. For example, in Indian law, you can't give jurisdiction to a court that doesn't have jurisdiction. And you don't know which other country may have similar law. So if there is no connection and there is no party staying there or doing business there, then probably you may not have that choice. I mean, I know for a fact that English law allows that because of the admiralty jurisdiction that English courts had exercised for many years. They have allowed international transactions having no connection directly to UK to have England. What happens to the order that comes? Is it enforceable in your country? Is it enforceable in the country where your counterparty lives? Is it enforceable in 6 countries where your counterparty may have assets and you may want to enforce it? The problem is, to know that answer, you will not need to check the law of each of those 6 countries to decide whether a judgment coming from an English court will be enforceable or rather executable directly without having to run one more round of litigation. See, these are the complications with court. Because of it, international arbitration really took off, especially in the international context, because what you have on the arbitration side is the New York Convention. And that to a very large extent assures you that in about 150 plus countries, any arbitration award passed in any of those 150 plus countries will be enforced. And that's a treaty obligation of these 150 countries. So that ways, enforceability is one thing that goes against courts in favor of arbitrations. But to answer the question, is court an option? The answer is yes, it's an option, but it has to be a very conscious, well thought of option in one specific case where you know exactly who the parties are, what is the level of, which are the countries that may be involved, and whether a judgment from that particular court will be enforceable everywhere. The question also is there something other than a traditional court and arbitration? The answer is a yes and a no, because something unique is evolving, but it's very much still like a court, which is these international commercial courts that have come up in the last few years. Singapore SICC being one of the very well-renowned and now picking up quite a bit. But I understand there is one in Brussels, in France, in Germany, but each one of them are attached to their national courts. And in a way, technically speaking, they are all courts, and what comes out of there will be an order of a court which can't be enforced through New York Convention. So the restrictions are still there. Now, what does it offer different from local courts? In some cases, a much easier procedure, much more international arbitration-like procedure. You may even have judges who are not from that country itself, like SICC has a lot of judges from all over the world as well. So it's a way to give you a more international option in the form of a court. If you're somebody who thinks for your transaction, you don't want arbitrations for whatever reasons, then a new option is evolving, but it is new, and you shouldn't blindly go and choose it without really being advised by somebody who has thought of all the pros and cons. Because as I said, anything new in the international context especially takes some time to be well understood and well implemented across the world, because otherwise, you may come up with a surprising order from some local court about how enforceable an order from these international courts may be. Now, coming back to arbitration, and I'll spend just about 3 minutes maybe on this. We often think about arbitration as something that is a known entity. You know exactly how it works, and you just pick a ready-made clause and go for it, and that's it. But one of the main reasons why arbitration really became popular with businesses in the past, 30 years before, when arbitration was not this well marketed in that sense, was that it was very flexible. It was thought of as an option that could be really tailor-made, as bespoke as you want. And in fact, in initial days, it was more of business people themselves who were becoming arbitrators than lawyers and judges. That's somewhere getting lost, because it's widely getting believed that arbitration is nothing but a private court and nothing else. But that's not true. Arbitration can be crafted to your needs, and it can be everything. Like it's from a ready-made off-the-shelf cloth to taking a ready-made off-the-shelf cloth and tinkering it around to mildly to suit you, to actually going to Savile Street in London and getting an absolutely bespoke suit for yourself. You can craft an arbitration clause the way you want. And therefore, how do you understand what are the things that you can possibly do with an arbitration user experience in that sense, taking a clue from the technical world? There are some things which are essential. So whether it's a phone that you use, in terms of whether you're using iOS or Android, any phone that you use has certain fixed elements which are there, which you can't change or you're advised not to change. And then there is a lot of user interface that's up to you. You can modify the home screen, download some apps, delete some apps, etc. Arbitration is the same. There are certain things that are very essential, and there are some things which, according to your use, you can adapt. Now, what are those essential choices? And I am talking strictly in terms of practical business use perspective, and not from the perspective of an academician. Because if my professor was seeing this slide, he would be unhappy with me, because this is not the essential elements of an arbitration clause from a legal perspective. But from a user perspective, I believe these are the most important essentials which you must have in your arbitration clause, whether you have something else or not. With this, you can be rest assured that most likely you will not have gateway issues. You will be swiftly able to get a tribunal in place and start your dispute. What are those seat of arbitration? Don't apply too much mind on understanding what exactly it means, especially in India with our judgments on seat ranging from Bhatia International to Balco and subsequently. Seat has become an unnecessarily complicated concept. All you need to know is whichever jurisdiction you trust to be arbitration friendly, select your seat as that and use the word seat. Say the seat of arbitration shall be, and name a city there, whether it's Singapore, Mumbai, London, Paris, just name it. And that's it. Have this one sentence in your arbitration clause. Please have it, because if you don't have it, you will have lots of trouble. You will spend litigation in various courts internationally to decide what is your seat of arbitration. And cases like that has happened. I'm sure you have heard of Enercon, where the party had to go to London and India, and there is a lot of footnotes of Enercon, which every lawyer now cites. But I'm sure for the disputing parties, especially for the party who wanted to make the claim, it was not a very happy situation. Similarly, governing law, please choose the governing law. Governing law of your transaction, of your contract, you must choose it. Don't leave it to be determined by applying conflict of law rules. Again, you can be surprised by what comes as a result of that. Choose your number of arbitrators. Don't go for exotic choices like 2 or 4 or 5 or 7. Choose 1 or 3. In every known case, 1 or 3 has worked. It's good enough, but choose it. Don't again leave it to default. Mostly default is sole, but if you have thought of it and you choose either 1 or 3, that will work for you. Choose the manner of appointment. Try not to leave it to a default court appointment in case both parties are not able to agree. So especially in sole arbitration, if 2 parties are not able to agree on the sole arbitrator, then please, even if you don't want to go for an institutional arbitration, and you should ask yourself why you don't want to, because in most cases, institutional arbitrations are more helpful, more efficient. But if in case you don't want to go for an institutional arbitration, probably appoint one of these institutes as your appointing institutes. Almost all international arbitration institutes also accept them being just the appointing authority. So if you both are not able to appoint, request will be made to say SIAC or ICC, and they shall appoint. And that's it. You will not follow the ICC rules. If you don't want to, fine. But try not to leave it to a court appointment. In various jurisdictions, a court appointment may take a long time. And also have some clarity on what kind of detail you need for the initiation. You can say just a notice being given is sufficient. If you want that there should be a cooling off period, you can provide for that. But think for a bit about how you want somebody to invoke the arbitration, or what we know as the notice of arbitration. Do you want it to have details? Ideally, don't have that, because most often when you want to initiate a dispute, you don't have details of what your claim will be, but you want to start the process because it takes time before the tribunal is in place, etc. Now, moving quickly to what are the advanced settings of arbitration UI. And this I must say with the usual disclaimer you see when you are getting into settings which are very complicated on any computer or phone. It says, don't touch this if you don't understand it. Take expert advice, and that advice I'll give you as well. Don't get into these customizations without somebody who understands international arbitration law well advising you on them, because otherwise that one customization here or there can open up so many questions and so many possibilities you have not thought of, that it will be like Abhimanyu entering the Chakravyuh without knowing how to get out of it. And very quickly, I'll run through what I mean by these points. As I said, seat is an essential. You must choose seat, but please avoid using the word place of arbitration and venue of arbitration. I talk from the Indian experience because so much pontification goes into what place of arbitration means, what venue of arbitration means. Often things which are counterintuitive. They result in things which are counterintuitive. Don't choose your venue. It does not matter. You choose your seat and rest. The arbitrator, with arbitrator's involvement, you will decide. Even if you choose the venue as Singapore, hearings can be held anywhere else. So what is the point of choosing the venue? Never choose the word venue in your arbitration contracts. Just leave it. Make sure the place of arbitration and venue of arbitration are phrases that don't appear in our arbitration clause. The phrase that appears is seat of arbitration. Again, governing law. I would say these are also exotic choices. All you need to choose is what law applies to your contract. The moment you go into with half knowledge or with one case law you may have seen somewhere or one update you may have read somewhere, to go ahead and choose the law of arbitration shall be so and so, or the law of arbitration agreement shall be so and so, it leads to hundreds of gateway complications. And again, you will become you will have the fate of being a footnote in legal history, which is of no use to you. Why do you want to spend time and money litigating before you actually litigate the dispute? So don't get into choosing more than the governing law of your contract, and rest. The fact that you have chosen your seat and your governing law, the rest will take care of itself. Avoid providing time periods, because frankly, if you have a good arbitrator, if you have a good arbitration institution, that's the best you can do. Sometimes practically it's not possible to abide by the time period you have thought of at the time of entering into the contract. And then what happens? Have you thought of what happens if the time period expires? If you say 3 months, the arbitration award should come. What happens if 3 months arbitration award doesn't come? As a claimant, is it in your interest to restart the arbitration or to dismiss the arbitrator? What is the consequence of that? There is no consequence. It's a strange choice people make in arbitration clauses without knowing what if it is not met. What happens then? Nothing. So, and if something happens, it can only be against you. If that time period is strictly applied, what will happen? The arbitrator loses his appointment. Okay, now you go look for a new arbitrator. You start the entire dispute again. That can't be in anyone's interest. So avoid providing for these unnecessary time periods. Avoid providing for prescriptive evidentiary rules. Don't provide all emails should be filed in this way, or you must give metadata. All these details you should not provide in your arbitration clause, but because it's often not possible for an arbitrator, for you to have forethought how exactly in practice, when the arbitration happens, maybe 5 years after you have entered into the contract, whether all these choices that you have made will be against you. and may actually be a hurdle to a efficient running of the arbitration. And one thing that I will advise you for sure, and again, I speak from my Indian experience, I think now with the Supreme Court in India also allowing and recognizing that it is possible for you to provide an appeal to an arbitration award, which is also an arbitration. So in that sense, a multi-tier arbitration. So you'll have an arbitration with a sole arbitrator. If you're not happy within 15 days, you can call for an appeal, and then you will constitute a 3-member tribunal. Why? If you wanted a 3-member tribunal, you get a 3-member tribunal to go with. If you want a sole arbitrator, go with sole. Ultimately, whether you have an appellate tribunal or not, finally, setting aside proceedings or a section 34 as it's in India and the article 34 of model law, that's the final take on whether the award will be sustained or not, which only a court of the seat can decide. So even if you have multi-tier arbitration, it's just a waste of time. You have done 2 rounds of arbitration and finally it goes to the test of court. So I believe you decide whether you want a sole or you want 3 and have that as your one and final arbitration. I don't think these multi-tier arbitrations are required. You may find them in some very specific institutional rules, but they are fine because they are run with experience by an institution in a very specific set of business. For example, GAFTA has these kind of clauses and they work very well, but they work well because it's very controlled. It's very, very controlled. The role of lawyers is almost negligible in GAFTA arbitrations. So if you are a part of that and it comes to you from there, fine. But just because you saw it work there, don't just import it into a absolutely independent situation, because that really will not work. That's it from my end. Back to you, Christopher. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Sumit. I think that was quite informative from Archana, Nitin, and Sumit. We have some time set aside for questions and for answers. There was a question asked of Archana. Maybe I'll let her, I mean, she's responded to the question in the chat, but perhaps Archana, you want to just deal with that. I think that was in relation to that example you gave of where the contractual obligation was to perform servicing at the place at which the, I suppose, machinery was. And on the facts there, the machinery was in the UAE, but the contracting party who was supposed to service didn't realize that and had to do it at their own expense. So the question is it common for people to, or parties to sort of put in obligations like that without talking about the expenses? And if that happens, then what does the party who will otherwise have to face those expenses do?
Right. So see, the thing is that now the answer to that would depend on a lot of things. It would depend on what is the law that they have chosen, how that law interprets contracts with this kind of a vacuum, and where is that law going to get enforced. So if very often you will find that you are entering a contract with an Indian party, but the actual services are being performed at the last minute, that party is changed to the subsidiary, maybe abroad. And in these kind of situations, because you need to sign, you quickly sign without realizing that, this may change some aspects of the enforcement. So I think if you were to look at it from the perspective of strictly from what is written in the contract, yes, it is that party's liability. And one could argue that that party has knowingly taken on this liability. So they have knowingly said, we will take on service at our expense. So given that should be enforceable. Again, it depends, like I said, on the, the different jurisdictions. But what we have seen is that this becomes a kind of an open-ended dispute between the parties, because the client is always entitled to believe that they are, since they have procured a product or since they are getting certain services, the remedial measures be also made available to them, and that the consideration they are paying is sufficient. So in these situations, what we have advised is you talk about it upfront and you discuss and decide as to you can divide it, from a contract drafting perspective. From a dispute perspective, maybe Nitin or Sumit can come in. From a drafting perspective, you divide it and say, if it is these locations, we will provide the services through our representative. We will choose the representative. And if it is XYZ locations, we'll provide it directly. So that may be one via media to arrive.
Thank you, Archana. I suppose the real lesson in that example is when obligations are undertaken, to fully understand and appreciate the ramifications of it, certainly on the bottom line, right?
Absolutely.
I have a question for you, Archana. I mean, yes, theoretically, of course, you need to keep alive all of these issues in your mind when you're negotiating. But how does relative bargaining power impact on how hard you can push? And are there techniques to sort of level the playing field if you are on the side of the weaker bargaining power?
Sure. So this is something that we face on almost an everyday basis. Very often, it's not just about the muscle power of the parties, but also about whether you're the vendor or the customer. So typically, the customer has a better and a higher say in terms of the contract. But I would say that you need to push for fundamental changes in that sense. So when a customer can see, or when your counterpart can see that you're being very reasonable, often they also tend to be reasonable. So you focus on the big issues, which would be ensuring payments come on time, ensuring payments come without deductions, ensuring that your IP is protected. In these kind of things, you should push forward. The other things that you can give them would possibly be, maybe timelines you could discuss and negotiate give them the ability to just dictate the timelines and try and meet those. So those kind of give and take is necessary. Having said that, we have seen that some customers, when they talk about specific situations. So in this case, understanding your business becomes very important. So you will know from your experience that let's say in a transaction with the US entity, you would have certain difficulties, in operating on ground. Or there may have been a situation where you have been pulled up in the US and you've had to sort of make some additional expenses. So in that kind of a situation, you will carve out only those particular issues from your contract. And you say that, okay, all right, on a broad principle, this is what we will agree to, but for only this purpose, I want a carve out. So that sort of helps push the contract in your direction without actually, the client. We find very often that the other party does agree. And this issue we see a lot in standard form contracts. So when clients send you their standard service agreements, then a lot of times they don't accept deviations. So you will know. So unless something is so core to your business, like for instance, ability to subcontract, I am not going to perform the services myself. So that is a very fundamental discussion that needs to happen. So this kind of thing, I think we advise clients to push for those core and critical points, and we relent or we agree to, let's say, a neutral jurisdiction for arbitration or dispute. When we are dealing with a EU party, we say, okay, we don't want to come to Netherlands, but we don't mind going to UK. So you sort of try to bargain and arrive at a midpoint.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions for panelists. So let me just have one I've written down for Nitin. Nitin, I think you mentioned as part of what a sort of competent and reasonably competent board would do, and I think you drew the point out that very often it's insufficient to simply leave it to the operational people, and that the directors sometimes, generally, certainly for SMEs, are also business owners, so it is in their interest to take ownership and take some proactive steps. But I'm asking this question in the context of, my question is, how important is it in that context for them to have external help? Professionals, could be lawyers, accountants. How important is that? And follow up. And the last point of that is, would you recommend even for SMEs to have in-house counsel?
So thank you, Christopher, for a twofold question, a very relevant and pertinent question in today's time because everything is cost driven. So I'll take the first question, the second question first, which is, as you said, whether SME to have an in-house counsel. So since everything is cost driven, when the promoters are factoring the cost, I must say that they should factor a cost for compliance and cost for advisory, because that is not a cost to my mind and to my knowledge. That is basically a wealth protection for the company, and one needs to see the quantum of the work, whether they need to outsourcing is more cost efficient versus keeping an in-house lawyer is more cost efficient. So the decision will by the promoter and owner will be depending upon the cost parameters, but do not consider it as a cost, consider it as a wealth protection. And for basically for a sustainable business, it is extremely important and vital. As far as your first question was concerned, which is mainly related to whether individual owners need to, promoters need to have expert advice, whether it's on accounting or a legal perspective. In different jurisdictions, the situations are different, Christopher, because I've seen many CEOs of the companies who are having a good legal acumen, very CFOs of the companies are having a very strong intuition and experience to deal with the legal aspects. So they may not need to outsource or to have the experts except on a one timely or a quarterly or once or annually basis to ratify certain policies for the company. Having said that, certain companies who are having a core people who are highly technical people, IT driven people, mechanical engineers, who run and who knows the business in and out, but there is a lot which goes in the financial side of it, accounting standard side of it. There is a lot which goes in the recent policy changes and advocacy, basically, which are attached to their core business. So one must need to consider by themselves, by at least interfacing with these experts in some regular intervals, to keep themselves updated. So either they can run down themselves, or otherwise they can at least a portion of it outsource it, to know that their business is aligned from the countries and jurisdictions and the policies or the proper framework to avoid any leakages or exposure in the future.
Yes, thanks, Nitin. But maybe I want to just add to say that I think it's quite important, certainly from, well, I mean, two parts, right? One is, as you say, wealth, sort of safeguard wealth and the business of the company, but also for those people who are independent directors of companies, or they're not really business owners, right? They're professional directors. Perhaps from, at least from the perspective of self-preservation, right. You should try to see if it is really something that you are capable of dealing with, or, to be fair, you need to get someone to help you. I think that's probably quite important too.
Right. Christopher, just want to add one very important aspect, which has been very recent days, been actively used by the MSME, is the directors and officers insurances.
Yes.
Like how we have medical insurances, because these directors may not be involved in the daily regular business activities. They may not aware about certain transactions being dealt by the executive or operational team. So one needs to really consider that as a very professional approach to protect from the future risk and exposure on them, because in nowadays, litigation cost may be as minimal as possible, but it can go into really a very high level, which one director innocently who got caught may not be able to really bear the cost in the individual capacity. So directors and officers insurance needs to be really looked into.
Yeah, thank you, Nitin.
Christopher, you are on mute.
Sorry, I also have a question for Sumit when he spoke. Yeah, Sumit, this is in relation to the issue of interim measures, right? So I think if I can summarize what you were saying is, it's quite important to try to think about contractual interim measures so that, in a sense, parties have already applied their mind to it, they've come to a landing, and they can, they know exactly what they need to do if something becomes a dispute, as opposed to at that point running to court or to an arbitrator and asking for interim emergency measures. The question is this, can such interim measures include, for example, a continuation of performance despite any dispute having arisen, including a alleged right to terminate the contract?
Absolutely. In appropriate cases, that can very well be the one of the contractually worked out interim measure or a contractually worked out solution to what happens if this happens in the future. For instance, I think in many EPC contracts or project-based contracts, there is often now, and this is all that comes over experience. So construction by and the things have come with experience. So those contracts already have inbuilt clauses of this kind. Very rarely you will find one which doesn't have, which says that no matter an arbitration is pending, no matter you have a dispute or you have a disagreement, you will need to keep up. Also this concept of engineering, which is there in these FIDIC contracts, etc. It's often the case that whatever be the disagreement at the time of execution, whatever engineer decides, you need to do that. You can take your claims later in arbitration, etc. So yes, this is very much something that exists in larger contracts and something that can be thought through in
Sorry, Sumit, I can't hear you. I think maybe your network is a bit
all right.
wonky.
Yeah. Okay, so was I not audible before?
No, just the last part. So I think
yeah, I just concluded by saying that it's a well understood provision in many different types of contracts where you say that despite a dispute pending, despite maybe an arbitration pending or a disagreement you may have, the obligations will continue and you will continue to perform. And I think even in smaller contracts, it's something that can be thought through. And if it appears appropriate to the given transaction, it's definitely a clause that should be introduced.
thank you. Yes, I think, does anyone, do any of the panelists have any questions you want to ask of each other?
I'm good. Nothing further from the panelists. It has been a wonderful discussion and interaction throughout.
Yes, yes. All right. So I think we've come to the end of today's session. There's some takeaways, I think, from each of the speakers, which is quite important, I think, to bear in mind. I think the first is, from what Archana spoke to us about, I think it's quite important, as she says, for a contracting party to appreciate why they are there trying to enter into a contract, you know, the sort of reason for the entire exercise, and then stay on that path, try to work with the other side, but then, you know, pay particular attention to various parts of the contract so that you don't see and undergo, you don't suffer the pain of an unknown, which you could have anticipated had you read the agreement or the draft carefully and move forward. Following from there, the second part, I think the takeaway from what Nitin has spoke to us about is the fact that having seen possible problems, you need to appreciate further what problems might arise and get help if you need to. Whether it is the director's own personal experience brought to bear or external assistance, directors have to take ownership of decisions that are being made instead of just leaving it to a functionary down the line. Because I suppose if the stuff hits the fan, you can get as upset as you want with your manager, but it's not going to help the company, right?
Correct.
And the third part from what Sumit spoke to us about, it is important, while a bit counterintuitive, I suppose, you know, because at the end of the day, business people don't like to believe that they're going to have problems down the line, but it's intelligent to assume that there might be problems down the line and see how best to resolve them. And I think Nitin gave us quite a good summary of the various steps that one can take. Well, it's been a pleasure interacting with all of you. I'm sure we'll have a session again where we'll meet some of each of us or all of us again. Let me thank the chair, Mr. Chowdhury, as well as our three speakers, Archana, Nitin, and Sumit. And I suppose I need to end with the fact that if any of the participants have any further questions, I think you have Pooja's contact, and do be in touch with her. And we can all, of course, always continue discussing these things offline.
Thanks,
So,
Christopher.
right. So with that, if I can just thank everyone for participating, and I wish you a very good rest of the day.
Thank you so much. Thank you all the
Thanks,
speakers.
everyone.
Thank you. I hope it was an informative session for all of you. And those who want to get connected with any of the speakers of this session, please write to me at pooja@siki.com and I'll get you connected. Thank you so much and have a good day ahead. Thank
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody,
you,
for
Christopher,
joining the
Mr. Chowdhury.
session. On behalf of Singapore Indian Chamber of Commerce, I'd like to thank you again for giving your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you, everyone.
Kaushik. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.